Hello, everybody. Just going to give it 30 seconds or so for some more people to join in. All right, we'll get started here. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Michelle Allison, and I'm the publisher of Top Crop Manager. I'm joined today by Dr. Alan Blaylock, Senior Agronomist with Nutrient Ag Solutions. Today, during our session, Alan will discuss soil test trends, crop nutrient removal, and nutrient management strategies. A special thanks to Economics for sponsoring our webinar today. To quickly make sense of today's crop nutrition research and maximize your return on investment, visit nutrient-economics.com. That's economics with a K. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after our live broadcast. The session is scheduled to run for approximately 45 to 60 minutes. Dr. Blaylock will speak for about 45 minutes, and following his presentation, we'll open up the floor to questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions tab found on the GoToWebinar panel on your computer screen. This webinar has been approved for 1 CCA CEU in nutrient management. Further instruction for submission via QR code or by email will be addressed after the question and answer period. Without further ado, I'll let you take it away, Alan.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Welcome to our webinar, everyone, today. Glad to have you with us. The subject of today's webinar is a review of soil test trends, nutrient removal, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the nutrient management implications. So I'm going to be reviewing some broad scale data with you from the Canadian provincial data set. We'll get into that in a minute, but I want to introduce the topic first by talking a little bit about balanced nutrition. Now, many of you have heard of what we call 4R nutrient stewardship. It's the system that we in the industry promote for nutrient management, and basically what it boils down to is we want to apply the right source at the right rate, at the right time, and in the right place with regard for the 3 major outcomes: social, economic, and environmental. So if we're considering all those possible outcomes, that helps give us guidance on how to manage these 4 R's, these 4 management practices, which certainly are not independent of each other. They're integrated. And so we want to talk about those in relation to soil testing and balanced nutrition, because those are certainly key components of 4R nutrient stewardship. So as I talk here, you may think you've signed into the wrong webinar, but I assure you the topic is about soil test trends and nutrient removal. But I've got a few slides here that I like to use to emphasize nutrient balance and the importance of plant nutrition. This is an illustration of a young wheat plant developing, and one of the key components of yield of wheat is tiller production. Each of those tillers can produce a head potentially if the environment is suitable, and so the number of tillers has a big contribution to yield. And these illustrations and some of the data I'm about to show you are come from North Dakota State University. Recognize that's in the US, but it all relates. So courtesy of Dr. Jay Goose and his colleagues. So tillering in wheat is an important factor, and it's profoundly influenced by early plant nutrition. Now, one of the things that Dr. Goose and his colleagues looked at was the contribution of the respective tillers and the development. So in this illustration, we have the percentage of the various tillers that were initiated in the green bars on the left, and then in the white bars on the right, we have the relative contribution of those tillers. So what we see is obviously every plant produced a main stem, then the T1 and 2 tillers appeared on almost all plants. The T3 tillers, which is simply going down the list, that would be from the 3rd true leaf, were initiated on about 60% of the plants. But what we see to the right is that the main stem, that main head, produced about half of the yield, and the T1 and T2 tillers produced the other half of the yield, and other tillers really added no significant contribution. So what does this say to us? Well, it says that it's really important to get those first 2 to 3 tillers. And the higher the yield potential, the greater the contribution of some of these tertiary and quaternary tillers becomes. In this case, it was a 46 bushel per acre yield. If we had a 60 or 70 bushel yield, we'd have more contribution from some of the other tillers. All right, now, related to our topic today, and from that study, was the influence of phosphorus on that tillering. So in this, we see in this slide, we have a graph of the initiation of the different tillers with and without phosphorus. So the dark red bar is with no phosphorus, and the lighter tan bar is with 30 pounds of phosphorus placed with the seed. So we see that without phosphorus, we barely get about 50%, 40 to 60% initiation of those 2 key tillers that are contributing to yield. But when we added phosphorus, we got 80 to 100% initiation of those tillers. So that's a key driver of yield potential, and we know phosphorus has a profound influence on that. Here's another study. This one was a long-term study out of Montana, Dr. Ardell Halverson and his colleagues. And what we're really looking here is cumulative yield production over the course of the study. And we have treatments with phosphorus and no nitrogen, the red and the green bars. And then we have phosphorus with nitrogen in the blue and the black lines. So what I wanted to point out with this, and this is resulting from a single application of phosphorus at the beginning of the study. So if we look at this highest yielding combination, the phosphorus and nitrogen together, the black line, with a single application of phosphate to build up the soil test, we see that that has long-term residual value. So in other words, a value in maintaining an adequate or a high soil test has great long-term value.
Alan,
all right, so let's,
second.
Excuse me, is there a question?
Yeah, we're not seeing your slides. We're still on the main screen, and I'm not sure if it's...
Oh, I am sorry. Let's see. Do you see it now?
Yes, so we're on the percentage.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Apologies to everyone for, should I back up? Apologies to everyone for not showing those slides. Let me back up a couple slides if that's possible. So here's the slides from the contribution of the tillers. Again, on the right, you see that the main stem and the T1 and 2 tillers contribute roughly half the yield. Here's the data I was talking about with the phosphorus contribution, the phosphorus making a big difference in the initiation of the tillers. And then here we have the long-term value of phosphate applied even from a single application, and that phosphorus contributing to greater yield throughout the course of a 15-year study. So you can see the value of maintaining soil tests. All right, so let's jump back to where we were. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to show you some data here. This is taken from the soil test inventory that was formerly maintained by the International Plant Nutrition Institute, is now maintained by the Fertilizer Institute since the IPNI has closed its doors and transferred this project to the Fertilizer Institute. And what we're looking at here is data that's collected from a large number of soil test laboratories. The laboratories are invited to submit their samples on an anonymous basis. So samples then go into a large database and they're analyzed, and the distribution of the sample analysis is plotted. And in the map, the blue numbers that you see, so for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, you see that 59, 81, and 64. That is the percentage of the samples submitted by the laboratories that were below the critical level for phosphorus. in the 2015 inventory. Now, by critical level, we simply mean the level that's identified by the provincial institutions, the level above which we would not expect further response to fertilizer, below which we would consider less than optimum. In other words, a response to fertilizer would be expected. So in Saskatchewan, for example, we have 81% of those samples that were testing below that critical level and really needing more phosphorus to be applied. So that's what we see in the top map. In the bottom map, what we're looking at is the change in that percentage. So in Alberta, for example, we have an increase of 1% from 2010 to 2015 of the samples that are below the critical level. So what that's suggesting is that the samples are declining slightly in phosphorus. If we look out to the maritime provinces, we see negative numbers. What does that mean? That means the number of samples below the critical level has decreased significantly, actually, by 11 and 18% in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. So that's suggesting they're applying more phosphorus, raising the soil test levels. So across the prairie provinces and Ontario and Quebec, we have a slight increase in the number of samples that are below optimum. So what does that tell us? Well, we're going to talk about that a bit more, but that should be that indicates a trend. These high percentages in the prairies of soils testing below the critical level should be of concern, given that we know how critical phosphorus is to the establishment of wheat and canola, our prairie crops. And in the east, for corn and soybeans, equally so. So when we look at those numbers and the change in those numbers, then that tells us something about the trends. Now, keep in mind that these are based on a large number of samples. They're provincial totals, as it were, and not intended to be a reflection of any given farm or any given sample, but it gives us some important information, some things that maybe we should watch out for in our own operations. So again, significant number of samples below the optimum in phosphorus, and really mostly maintaining those levels to declining slightly. All right, so I was able to get a hold of some very recent data. This is draft data. This has not been released to the general public, but I got from TFI the most recent inventory for the prairie provinces and Ontario. And so we want to look at a couple of things. So what you see is the percentage of the samples in each of these soil test ranges. So say from 16 to 20 parts per million in a Bray equivalent. That's the percentage of samples in that grouping, and you can see for the different years the changes in those bars. And we'll talk about those specifically. So if we look at Alberta, for example, we see a decrease in the percentage of samples in these lower ranges. And I colored those arrows green because that suggests to me that we're building those soils up to more desirable levels, such as these middle groups. And you see over here 31 to 35, 36 to 40, you see some slight increases in those groups. And out here on the far right, we see an increase in the number of samples greater than 50 parts per million. I colored that arrow red because I look at that and say, that could be of concern because it's at those higher levels where we tend to start to see environmental issues, more runoff, in some cases even some leaching. So when we exceed those soil test levels, then that becomes a greater environmental risk. We want to really maintain the soil test kind of here in the middle of the range, around that, say 25 to 30 part per million range would be desirable. So decreasing numbers of samples on the low end, but some samples increasing on the very high end. We look at Saskatchewan, to some degree, the same picture. We're decreasing the number of samples on the very low end. We're increasing some of those in the middle, so that's kind of a good thing. And out here on the right, again, some increase in the very high samples, although in Saskatchewan it's really a small number and maybe not of too much concern. So let's take a look at Manitoba and Ontario. Manitoba looks very much like Alberta. We're decreasing the number of samples that are in the deficient range, but yet again, we're increasing those that are excessive and of environmental concern. Ontario, interestingly enough, we're increasing the number of samples in the deficient range where we would be concerned about having enough phosphorus, but yet we're decreasing those soils that are excessive. So this is a good thing in the lake area of Ontario, where they're surrounded by all these lakes where phosphorus in the water is concerned, particularly Lake Erie. So this is a positive change. We're decreasing the number of samples that would be most prone to those environmental impacts. But we're maybe not maintaining some of these samples on the low end where more phosphorus would be needed for optimum crop performance. All right, so one of the things that plays into this is from a different database. This a database called NuGIS, and this database tracks by either county or watershed level nutrient use and nutrient removal. So nutrient use is based on fertilizer use statistics, sales numbers, and the removal is based on yield potential and some removal factors per unit of yield. Now, unfortunately, NuGIS doesn't have Canadian data at this point, but we may be able to extrapolate some across the border. So when we look at this here in the northern plains of the US, we have these areas marked in yellow that are approximately in balance. In other words, we're removing about the same amount of P2O5 that we're applying in fertilizer and or manure. But there are also these orange areas where we're actually removing more than is being applied. So how does this relate to the previous graphs that I showed for soil test trends? Well, if we're already deficient, and remember, there were a high percentage of those samples in the northern plains and the Canadian prairies that are already deficient in phosphorus, and we're not really increasing those. If anything, we're maybe decreasing slightly, and that is probably attributed to this removal ratio, where we're actually removing more phosphorus than we're replacing. So we'll come back and talk about nutrient replacement as a strategy and how that fits into a person's nutrient management program. But just kind of keep this picture in mind. We're not too far deficient if we were in the red, like some of these other areas that we see here in the US, where we're removing a lot more than we're replacing. Those would be of greater concern. All right, so now let's look at potassium. In the prairies in the northern plains, we have a lot of soils that are very high in potassium, and so the idea that we could mine that potassium for our crops is certainly valid. Some of these soils are very high. We'll look at those distributions, but there are still some fairly significant numbers of samples here in Alberta. Roughly half of the soils testing low in potassium. That actually surprised me a little bit, higher than I would have guessed. And in the eastern provinces, more than half of the soils are below the critical level for potassium. And those areas where we're growing corn and soybeans with pretty high potassium uptake and potassium removal, that is of concern. So then in the lower map, we see that the picture is pretty similar to that of phosphorus. We have a slight increase in the number of samples that are testing below the critical level. So what does this mean? Well, that's not much concern in those soils that are testing very high. But if we take these provinces like Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, where we have samples, significant numbers of samples that are low in potassium, and we maybe don't traditionally apply potassium in some of those soils, that's something that's kind of a watch out, something we want to take a look at. Take a look at our soil samples and make sure that we're applying adequate potassium. Now, one of the things that's come into question this year is, how do I manage nutrients in dry conditions? And so far, much of the geography we're talking about has been quite dry. And the question has come up, do I change management for that? Well, one thing to keep in mind about potassium is that it's very important in regulating plant moisture status and in drought tolerance. So if we're in these soils that are below optimum in potassium, then it becomes important to make sure that we're applying adequate amounts. So again, similar story to phosphorus. Let's take a look at the actual distribution. So here we have, again, Alberta and Saskatchewan, same slide we saw before. And we have increasing numbers of samples, even more so maybe than the phosphorus, increasing numbers of samples in this deficient range, the very low range in Alberta. Here in the range where we kind of would like to maintain 120 or so up to about 200, fairly stable, but these low testing samples could be of concern in some areas. Not much really, no discernible trends out here on the right in the high end, except for some of these groups in these very high testing soils are declining. These are high enough that that's doesn't really matter at that level. If I'm declining a bit, I can mine that potassium because I have more than I actually need. But these on the left in the low testing categories are of concern. In Saskatchewan, a bit more stable, not a lot of change occurring, but we are seeing a little bit of noise here maybe in the data, but we are seeing a fairly substantial increase in the number of samples that are very high testing, more than 300 parts per million. Now, again, we have lots of soils that are high in K naturally, but for that to be increasing would be of concern in that it's possible that we're applying excess fertilizer where it's not needed, and that is an economic consideration. So want to pay attention to that and make sure that if we're applying potassium, it's in places where it's needed and not on these soils that are so high. So here we have Manitoba. Again, not a lot of change in the middle of the chart, in the middle ranges, but we are tending to increase somewhat these deficient soils where potassium would be needed. Now, with the increase in acreage for corn and soybeans in Manitoba, this becomes more of a concern, those crops having a higher requirement and higher removal rates. So that could be part of what's happening here, is greater crop removal from corn and soybeans than we might have from wheat and canola. And then in Ontario, soils that are more weathered, they're a bit older, less natural potassium. We see a lot of the soils kind of on the lower end of the range, not too many on the very high end like we have in the prairies. But the fact that we're not increasing those samples could be a concern where we have large crop demand from the crops that are grown in those eastern provinces. So would like to see these samples that are very low move up into a more optimum range to maintain adequate potassium. So then again, we look at the removal to use balance, and we see throughout the plains of the US and in the western states, we're very negative in terms of balance. And again, that's not an immediate cause for concern because many of these soils are very high in potassium. There are some areas where there are low testing soils that should be of concern. But when we look at the balance, we're removing roughly 10 to 50 pounds of potassium, K2O, in excess of what we're applying. So over time, we want to pay attention to this because soils that may be adequate today in the future may not be, and so we want to pay attention to that and continue to monitor those soils. Now, if we're in a soil that does happen to test low currently, this removal rate could be more serious in that we don't want those soils to decline further. So these are just macro trends in this data. Now, there's also data available for sulfur, but given that the sulfur soil test is considered to be not as reliable as the soil test for P and K because of organic cycles and atmospheric deposition that play into sulfur availability, one of the things that I look at even more is this atmospheric deposition. I'm going to show you some maps of that. And the other thing that's occurring is yields of many of the crops that we're growing in this region have been increasing over the decades. So greater yields means greater sulfur removal and greater crop demand. And in many of these areas, historically, we haven't really seen sulfur responses, but we're starting to see them now because of the drop in atmospheric deposition. So I'm going to show you a couple maps here. So this is atmospheric deposition. This is measured and tracked in a program of the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. They monitor atmospheric deposition of a variety of elements, and sulfur being one. So back in 1985, we had this, the industrial East, or the Rust Belt, or whatever you want to call it, a lot of sulfur emissions from factories and power plants burning coal, which emits sulfur, going into the atmosphere and then being redeposited as acid rain. So 1985, in much of the eastern half of the US, and we could extrapolate this right up into Canada, those trends would be similar. But at that time, we were receiving 20 to 25 kilograms of sulfur per hectare or more, and that would satisfy the needs of most of the crops that are being grown. So we didn't need to add fertilizer. And now we look at that picture today in 2000, our most recent data available, 2018, and we see very low rates of sulfur deposition, a few hot spots where there may be still some power plants or oil refining down here on the Gulf Coast, some of those areas. But what this map tells us is that we're no longer getting sufficient sulfur from atmospheric deposition to satisfy crop demand, and therefore we're seeing more widespread sulfur deficiencies and response to sulfur fertilizers. Now again, this map is really only from the US, but the trends would be similar. The atmosphere, the atmospheric currents would push those same deposits northward into Canada. So we could extrapolate from that we would see the same patterns in Canada. And indeed on canola, particularly in Western Canada, we see sulfur responses with some frequency, though it may be less than half the time, but still it's there. And in the East on corn and soybeans, which have high sulfur requirements. So that's a trend for sulfur. Now, let's take a look at a couple of the micronutrients that are part of this published survey and that may be of particular concern. So in this first map, I'm showing zinc, and we look at the prairie soils, and there are a large number of soils that are deficient in zinc. So using 1 part per million DTPA zinc as a critical level, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, we're over half of those soils testing deficient in zinc. That may not be a big problem in wheat. Wheat is not as responsive maybe as some of the other crops, and it requires lower levels. But when we move to crops like flax or the pulses or corn and soybeans, then zinc becomes much more important, or the amount of zinc we need becomes much more important, and a 1 part per million critical level might suggest we need to even be applying zinc for some of those crops. So something to pay attention to in the soil test. Now, if we go out to the Maritimes, have a very high percentage of those soils that are deficient in zinc, but we also have a lot of sandy soils where they don't have as much residual mineral content, maybe growing some specialty crops where there's more removal, like potatoes in PEI. So it's a different crop mix. Then again, in Ontario, we see a lower number, and perhaps this is a result of growing more corn and soybeans and more fertilization having taken place, or perhaps it's a result of native minerals. But nonetheless, these are trends that we want to watch for particularly in Manitoba, as the cropping system has changed somewhat from the wheat canola rotation to include more corn and soybeans and some other crops. And particularly flax is a crop that's notoriously responsive to zinc and has a high zinc requirement. So as we switch to some of those crops, certainly something to pay attention to on our soil tests. And then we look at chloride, which is also a micronutrient, and really it's only really become an issue in the interior of the country, because areas near the coast, near the oceans, get sufficient chloride from atmospheric deposition. It comes off the seawater in the mist and gets moved a little bit inland. So those areas closer to the oceans generally get sufficient chloride for crop needs, and in some cases even excess. But in the interior of the country, we don't get that atmospheric deposition. And in many of these soils, we have high potassium, so we don't apply potassium chloride or potash fertilizer, muriate of potash, because we don't need the potassium. So sometimes we don't get the chloride that we need. Now, it doesn't look to be a major problem in the prairie provinces, but considering that the cereal crops that are prominent in that region are very responsive to chloride and have a high chloride requirement, particularly wheat, it's just something to watch out for on the soil test. Down in the US, there's been a lot of studies on chloride nutrition of wheat showing that response, and it's obvious from the soil test inventory why we see those responses throughout the Great Plains in our wheat producing regions. But similar research in Canada has also documented those responses. And while many of these soils are not deficient, it's important to pay attention to it, because some soils are, and the crops that we grow are responsive to that nutrient. So in any case, as we look at these inventories, you want to consider the crop, its sensitivity to those nutrients, the cropping system, and the specifics of the situation. All right, I wanted to point this out, bring this chart up for zinc, looking at the change from 2010 to 2015 in the distribution. And this is the total for all the provinces, the 4 provinces that I mentioned. And I guess what strikes me is, while there weren't a high percentage of the samples showing deficiency, when I look at this graph, we have a pretty sharp decline in that 5 years from 2010 to 2015 in soils containing adequate zinc, and a sharp increase in the soils here on the deficient end, below 1 part per million DTPA. So just something to keep in mind as you take a look at your soil tests and evaluate nutrient requirements, because we don't want to slip too far down into this range. We'd like to maintain somewhere. I like to see about 1 to 1.5 parts per million zinc for most crops, although some crops like flax, in some cases corn, dry beans, 1.5 would be kind of the minimum where I would like to maintain that. So again, varies by crop, but just again, something to pay attention to in your soil tests. All right, so let's talk about some of these trends, just as a way of review. Seen many samples below the optimum in P and K, and while that seems to have stabilized, we're not really rebuilding those soils. So we have a lot of samples that are deficient, and we're kind of staying at that level. So that may be an area of concern. We also have P and K removal exceeding applications. So that we might conclude from that we're not going to increase those soil tests while removal is exceeding the applications. The number of samples below optimum in zinc, and while the percentage of the total is not great, the movement of samples with adequate zinc to more samples with inadequate zinc would be of concern. And then this idea of mining nutrients in high testing soils. We obviously have a lot of soils that have more than adequate phosphorus and potassium and some of the other nutrients, and that's okay to mine those and take advantage of those stored soil nutrients. That's perfectly a reasonable practice. particularly in tight economic times like we've been through in recent years. Rely on those reserves, but recognize that those reserves are not infinite, that at some point, if we continue to mine, we will deplete those soils, and then we would have to get back on a program of rebuilding those nutrient levels. Now, why do we want to maintain those levels? Well, I like to maintain high soil tests because I think it gives me more flexibility. One, it gives me the flexibility to take advantage of better growing conditions without necessarily adding more fertilizer. If I have better growing conditions, my soil nutrients are adequate, my crop is able to respond to those conditions. If my soil is deficient and I'm only applying enough for, say, a typical growing year, and then I have those good conditions, now I don't have the capacity to respond. The crop is going to be limited by nutrients rather than maybe some of the other environmental variables. So I like to maintain soil tests at a high level, not excessive, but at a high level where the crop has the capacity to expand or respond. Now, the other flexibility it gives me is economic flexibility. So we look again at the recent years where crop prices have not been particularly good and many farmers have struggled economically. So mining those high testing soils makes sense. But if I'm at the high soil test level, I have the flexibility to say cut back or maybe forego a particular nutrient. If my soil test is adequate, maybe I can cut back a little in times of poor cash flow. But then rebuild during times of good cash flow. So that leads me to this coming season and some comments about that and thinking about this year's nutrient strategy. All the forecasts are for good crop prices. Prices are of all our major crops are on the rise. Yes, fertilizer prices are also rising, but they're still a good value compared to the value of the crop. So maybe this is the year where we take a look at our cash flow, our other obligations, and the various bills that we have and the various inputs we have. Maybe this is the year to reinvest a little of that better cash flow into our soil nutrient bank, particularly in fields that may have been on the decline that need to be built up. Maybe you can't do the whole farm, but maybe there are certain fields that may benefit from building soil nutrient levels. So a year like this one with better crop prices may be the opportunity to replace some of those nutrients that have been spent from that soil nutrient bank. So these, and particularly suboptimal soils that we see, there are many of those across the prairies. We should be monitoring those, build them up if possible, maybe put them on a schedule to build up over a period of time. Certainly, it's often not economical to do it in 1 year, but we maybe can do it over several years. So monitoring is a good thing to keep in mind. So a review of what we've seen. Remember, these are general provincial trends, and they show gradual decline in soil test levels of a number of these key nutrients. That's maybe not a good thing, but in any case, each of those needs to be evaluated on a site-specific basis by farm, by field, and maybe even areas, subfields, areas of specific fields that may be problematic, low yielding areas or areas that maybe we're already aware are deficient in particular nutrients. These general provincial trends don't tell the story for an individual farm. They're simply trends that maybe give us some clues as to some things to look for in our specific farm soil testing program. Soil test regularly. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to test for all of these nutrients every year. Soil P and K levels don't change particularly dramatically from 1 year to the next. Maybe if we pull off an extremely large crop, maybe we want to check it after that to see if there's been a significant change. But because of the buffering capacity of the soil, it's relatively slow change. So I've seen recommendations to test every other year, to test every third year for P and K and pH and organic matter. but we should be on a regular pattern of soil testing. And also a key thing of soil testing regularly, it's advised to soil test at the same time of the year. So if we're going to test in the fall, let's test in the fall every year. If we're going to test in the spring, do it in the spring every year, because those values can change from fall to spring with freezing and thawing, wetting and drying cycles. Some nutrients may get freed up, or they may be tied up. And so those values can change just due to those things, but it's not really a change in what's actually there. So testing at the same time every year, testing on a regular schedule, and most importantly, keep records and watch the trends. Am I declining? Am I increasing? Am I holding steady? That will give you some insights as to how to manage going forward. Consider build and maintenance strategies. As we mentioned, in soils that have been depleted, pay attention to that, and maybe it's time to get on a build strategy, or maybe I'm at the point, at a level I want to stay at, and I want to maintain there. So many of the institutions have schedules for build-up strategies or maintenance strategies that can be helpful. And consider the economics and cash flow. That's obviously a big part of those decisions. It's not just the soil test, it's what's the economics of a buildup or a maintenance or a sufficiency strategy, and how does that fit long-term with my economic situation. So considering this nutrient bank, just a few points on that, and then I'll give you some resources and we'll wrap up. Crop removal is an additional piece of information. So the soil test gives us some information. The soil test is what I call a probability indicator. It's an indicator of the likelihood to get a crop response to fertilizer. And replacing what is removed is one way of approaching that maintenance. In order to build the soil test level, I'm going to have to apply more than what is removed. And so that's when I start looking at long-term economics. Now, I've thrown some numbers up here that roughly 20 pounds of P2O5 per acre applied would raise the soil test 1 part per million, 6 to 10 pounds of potash per acre to raise the soil 1 part per million. These are very, very general guidelines, and remember, they're not specific, and soils differ widely, so every soil is going to be a little bit different. Some of our prairie soils with very high calcium carbonate background may take a lot more phosphorus to raise the soil test. In some cases, they're so highly buffered, it's very difficult. So very, very general guidelines. But if I'm going to remove, say, 60 pounds of phosphate per acre in the harvested crop, well, then that suggests that I'm probably going to see a decline of something like 3 parts per million. So maybe in 1 year, that's not significant, but over several years, it could be. Sufficiency levels versus build and maintenance strategies. Sufficiency levels is a concept that basically, if I'm at a certain level, then that supplies me a certain sufficiency of the nutrient. If I'm above the critical level, then I should not need to apply any more. And I can continue to do that until the soil drops below the sufficiency level. Where if I am below the sufficiency level, then maybe I want to consider build or maintenance strategies. And again, consider economics. And I add here environmental risk, because if we start down the path of building soil phosphorus, we want to be careful with applying excess phosphorus, because excess, as we mentioned before, can translate to environmental risk. And so we want to be careful about that risk as well. So there's both economic risk and environmental risk. All right, I'm going to skip over these last or that slide. I did want to wrap up with a statement that I ran across many years ago, and I still very much like, from famous soil chemist Willard Lindsay, who was at Colorado State University, our home institution here. He said, advances in soil testing may not be made by searching for the ideal extractant for all soils, but they may be made by carefully standardizing procedures and improving its interpretation with the inclusion of important soil factors that affect extractability and availability of nutrients. So when we think about nutrient availability and relating to the soil test is a piece of information. It's an indicator of the probability of response. But there are other indicators such as soil moisture, root growth. Do I have compaction? Do I have anything that restricts the availability of the nutrients? pH can be a factor. Temperature can be a factor. So when I start looking at all of that together, I may add other probability indicators to that soil test that can suggest a modification of my recommendations or my nutrient strategy. So with that, I want to introduce you to our economics website, where we have some tools that may help you in relation to the things we've talked about today. So I'm going to go to that website and just show you a couple of those things. So we'll wait for that website to load here. So this is available to everyone. It's free. There's no charge. So simply go to nutrient-economics with a K.com. And here we find, so here's one tool, a nutrient removal calculator. So you can enter information about your crop. We have all kinds of crops here. We can enter, for example, alfalfa, and I put in a yield, let's just put in 5 tons per acre and calculate. And here's the nutrient uptake and removal. Now, in the case of alfalfa, those two are the same because we remove the entire crop. In a grain crop, we only remove part of the nutrients. So if you want to evaluate what your nutrient removal is like, this is a tool that maybe could be helpful. One of the other tools, there's a nutrient ROI calculator. So you can enter in information about your crop. Waiting for it to load here. So choose a crop, select a region, put in your soil test level, enter all the information. You can actually put in nutrient prices, crop price, and it will give you the economic value of the nutrients being removed in the crop. So that may be something that's useful for you. There are some other tools here, growing to read calculator. That's a discussion for another day. There's a rainfall tracker that pulls data from weather services. And then there's also this tool, which is the geographic data, contains the same data that I showed you from the TFI database. We pull that data to operate in the background, so you can here select a province and pull up the soil test trends for the province, or they're in tables below. So here, for example, for Saskatchewan, percentage of soils below the critical level in a small table. So you can download the entire database. It's a very large file, many pages, 40 some pages of data, to actually get some additional data on crop removal and nutrient balance, similar to what I showed you from the NuGES site. So those are some tools that may be of interest for some of you. You can log on and play around with that. Again, those are high-level trends, but may give you clues as to what you want to look at. So with that, I'll go back to the we'll go back to the presentation and take any questions that we may have.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the informative presentation, and thank you everybody for your patience as we got the slides rolling at the beginning. So before we dive into some questions, I'd again like to thank our sponsor, NutrientEconomics, once again for sponsoring today's live webinar. We've got a few questions here. So, Alan, can we really correct soil test phos in the prairies in an economical way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I sort of alluded to that, but one thing to keep in mind is that these prairie soils, a lot of them are very low in phosphorus. And sometimes the phosphorus fixing capacity of the soil is so great that we keep applying more and more and more phosphorus, and the soil test doesn't seem to change. And if we're in one of those kinds of soils, then it may be very difficult to raise that soil test economically, and then we need to do other things to improve the efficiency of our phosphorus uptake, such as banding or seed placement of the phosphorus, or in some cases there may be additives, biostimulants, or phosphorus solubilizing bacteria that may be useful to add to that phosphorus band, maybe dual placement of nitrogen and phosphorus. But In many soils, yes, we can raise soil test phosphorus, but recognize that it's usually best if we can spread that over a number of years, unless we have a really good year financially and we want to invest in that soil bank. If we're leasing the land, we're maybe less inclined to do that if it's a short-term lease. If we own the land or a long-term lease, maybe more interest in spending the money to build that up. But there may be some soils where it's just not economical to do so.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense for sure. Another one here is, should I be concerned about soil potassium soil test trends when they're starting so high?
Yeah, so I kind of addressed this in part maybe in the presentation. We do have a lot of soils that are extremely high, and in those soils, I don't really care so much about that depletion. I can go ahead and mine that potassium, take advantage of it, but I still want to monitor and soil test for that periodically so that I avoid depleting the soil to the point where it starts to affect crop yield. When I deplete it to the point that it's getting close to that critical level or below that critical level, then I've gone too far. And that's when we want to think about starting to replace that, or we're going to lose crop yield. But as long as some of these soils are 300, 400, 500 parts per million, no, I'm not concerned about the downward trend in those soil tests when we're at those levels until we get down into the range closer to that optimum level.
Okay. What would a rough building rate of zinc be in active pounds?
That's a tough one. I haven't seen particular data on that like I showed for phosphorus and potassium. But I'll just give you some guidelines that I've seen over the years from various institutions. When I was at the university, our recommendations at University of Wyoming were somewhat similar to this. And basically, if the soil is deficient, if you want to build it up, a typical rate that I see recommended is like 10 pounds per acre. Now, everybody immediately revolts against that 10 pounds per acre because that's really expensive. But a zinc application at that rate is probably going to last you for a number of years, 4 or 5 years, maybe even, before you would need to apply again. So when we're talking about those kinds of rates with the micronutrients, those are not for 1 year, those are for multiple years. Now, what I found better success with in the case of zinc, and I've seen this in a number of places in my own research as well as others, is banding a more modest rate close to the row, side band, or even with the seed, something on the order of 1 pound or 2 pounds per acre actually gave me better and more consistent results than applying a large buildup application. But if the soil is extremely deficient, maybe you can do some combination of both, a reduced rate, maybe broadcast for a little bit of a buildup coupled with the band. That would be what I would recommend in very deficient soils. But if it's marginal or only modestly deficient, I really, with the micronutrients, I like banding probably better than broadcasting anyway.
Okay, perfect. So, with that, do you have any comments on the future of broadcast application with respect to the type of nutrition?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about that. I am a fan of banding. When possible to band nutrients close to the row or in the proximity of the row, I prefer that. If you have the equipment, if the fertilizers you're using are manageable in a banding system, I really prefer that. I've seen data both in Canada and in the US, a variety of different crops and cropping systems that lead me to that conclusion. I'm a fan of banding whenever possible. Now, if we have a really low testing soil, like I mentioned with zinc, there is a value in having some background nutrients. Say I'm really low in phosphorus. There is value in having some phosphorus in the bulk soil in addition to what I put in the band. because if I'm in the band, I only have a small portion of the roots exposed. And so having some of the roots in the bulk soil or the roots in the bulk soil exposed to some level of phosphorus can be synergistic. So there may be value in broadcasting those nutrients in very low testing soils where I'm trying to apply higher rates to build up more than I could put in with a seed or banded. Then there may be some benefit to applying those broadcast rates. And again, it depends on the tillage system, the broadcast. Broadcasting these immobile nutrients, P and K and zinc, on the surface in a no-till system is going to restrict their availability, particularly in dry years. Now, if I'm in a wetter environment, say the eastern provinces where I get more rainfall, the soil stays more moist, I have more root activity near the surface, broadcasting may be more valuable. It may have more benefit, but in these semi-arid regions, broadcasting these immobile nutrients on the surface can restrict their availability because the surface soil oftentimes gets too dry for good nutrient uptake, good root activity. So while there in some situations can be value to broadcasting nutrients, I think more and more, and I think the Canadian production system has moved in this direction largely towards more banding, side banding, mid-row banding, seed placement. A lot of our US cropping systems, we're still broadcasting nutrients. I'm not sure that's the best. Now, that said, I understand there are a number of growers who like to broadcast nitrogen, floating nitrogen on the crop. That's the effectiveness of that is going to be dependent on moisture to move that into the root zone. Nitrogen being mobile will move into the root zone, and so maybe that makes a little more sense. If I have good moisture, I can do that before a good rainfall. That might make more sense, but I don't really like broadcasting of the immobile nutrients, P and K and zinc, those nutrients.
Okay, perfect. So to keep us on schedule here, I've got one last question and then I'll jump into the closing remarks. Can you comment on the geographies that economics covers and where the calculators are applicable?
Yeah, so as you saw in the geographic data I pulled up, we have those nutrient removal calculators. Those are good all across North America. It's North America only. Unfortunately, we have not added data to go outside North America, but all of the US and Canada. So those tools are available to all of our customers. The ROI calculator, the same thing. You can put in your own crop yield data, your own crop prices for wherever you are, and those will work. So NutrientEconomics is really designed to serve all of North America.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the presentation and for your time today, Alan. If you have any other further questions, everybody don't hesitate to reach out. I do have a few on hand here that I'll share with Alan after the webinar is complete. Andrea, if you can put up the QR code here for me. All right, so before we end today, here is your chance to collect the CCA CEU credit in nutrient management. To collect the credit for this webinar, just open your CCA app on your smartphone, click scan course code, and hold your phone up to the monitor so the camera can hover over the code. If you are able to do this, your CEUs will be submitted immediately. But if this does not work for you, please email your first name, last name, and CCA number to topcrop@annexbusinessmedia.com, and we'll submit your credit for you. And I'll type that into the chat here as well. And a follow-up email will be sent out within 24 hours, which will hold the recording of the webinar and our email address for any feedback, questions, or to submit your CCA information. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Blaylock, for your presentation, and thank you all for tuning in today to today's webinar. Don't forget to visit topcropmanager.com/webinars to view all of our recorded webinars and to register for any upcoming webinars in the future. I'll type in our email address, and with that, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.